She stood in front of the ATM in downtown Caracas, watching a line of people wait patiently as the machine dispensed what looked like endless streams of paper. Patricia Poleo had seen many economic crises in her decades as a Venezuelan journalist, but this was different. This wasn't just about numbers or statistics. This was about the fundamental collapse of the most basic assumption of modern life, that money has meaning. The woman in front of her walked away, carrying a plastic bag filled with banknotes. The withdrawal limit was 20,000 bolivars. At the official exchange rate, this was supposed to be about $200. In reality, it was enough to buy a single cup of coffee. Patricia watched as the woman immediately walked across the street to a currency exchange booth, where she traded her bag of bills for $3 American. This scene, repeated millions of times across Venezuela, revealed something that no economic theory had prepared the world to understand. When money dies, life doesn't stop. It adapts, it innovates, it finds a way. But the world had chosen to focus only on the death part of the equation, the incomprehensible number. Patricia had spent her career making complex stories accessible to ordinary people. But hyperinflation presented a unique challenge. How do you explain a number that the human mind cannot process? In 2018, inflation in Venezuela reached 1,000%, not 1,000%, not 10,000%, but 1,000,000%. To put this in perspective, if you had saved 100 bolivar at the beginning of the year, by the end of that year, you would need 1,000,000 bolivars to buy the same item. But even this comparison understates the reality. Prices weren't just rising annually, they were doubling every few weeks. Patricia documented how a kilogram of rice went from 150 bolivars to 300 bolivars to 600 bolivars to 200 bolivars, not over months, but over days. Shop owners stopped printing price tags. Instead, they used whiteboards that they could erase and update several times per day. Some stores simply posted the day's dollar exchange rate and calculated all prices in real time. The outside world looked at these numbers and saw economic collapse. They saw chaos, failure, the inevitable consequence of bad policies and authoritarian rule. What they missed was the extraordinary adaptation taking place beneath the surface. While the official economy was imploding, Venezuelan society was quietly conducting one of the largest economic experiments in modern history, the survival economy. Patricia discovered this parallel economy during a visit to the Mercado de San Martin in Caracas. Officially, Venezuela was experiencing the worst economic crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Unofficially, this market was busier than she had seen it in years. People were buying and selling. Businesses were operating. Transactions were happening. The only thing missing was Venezuelan money. She watched a woman buy vegetables using a smartphone app. The vendor scanned a QR code. The payment was processed instantly, and the transaction was complete. No cash, no bolivars, no physical money at all. The payment was made in what locals called digital dollars, a cryptocurrency-based system that had evolved organically as traditional banking collapsed. In another stall, a man was trading cooking oil for gasoline using a complex bartering system. A notebook recorded the transactions. 2 liters of oil equals 1 liter of gasoline equals 500 grams of flour equals 3 eggs. These ratios changed daily, but everyone in the market seemed to know the current rates by heart. What looked like chaos to an outside observer was actually an intricate system of exchange based on real value rather than abstract currency. Patricia realized she was witnessing something that economists had theorized about but rarely observed: the spontaneous emergence of money alternatives in a society where official money had ceased to function. Venezuelans hadn't just adapted to hyperinflation, they had transcended it. The psychology of worthless money. The human relationship with money is deeply psychological. Money works because people believe it works. When that belief collapses, strange things happen to social behavior. Patricia observed these changes throughout Venezuelan society. She interviewed a grandmother who had worked for 30 years as a school teacher, saving bolivars for her retirement. When hyperinflation hit, her life savings became literally worthless. Not metaphorically, but mathematically. The stack of bills that represented decades of work couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Rather than despair, she had become one of Caracas's most successful informal money changers, using her mathematical skills to calculate real-time exchange rates. Patricia met teenagers who thought in multiple currencies simultaneously. They might receive their allowance in bolivars, convert it immediately to dollars on their phones, spend it in Colombian pesos at the border, and measure their wealth in grams of gold. For them, the idea of a single, stable currency was as foreign as the concept of communicating without smartphones would be to their grandparents. Most fascinating was the psychological liberation that many Venezuelans described. The elderly teacher explained it this way: when money became worthless, we had to rediscover what actually has value. Time, relationships, skills, things you can touch and use. I understand wealth better now than when I had savings in the bank. The global misunderstanding. Patricia spent months trying to understand why the international community so consistently misread Venezuela's hyperinflation. The answer, she realized, lay in the assumptions that observers brought to their analysis. Western economists approached hyperinflation as a technical problem: too much money chasing too few goods, resulting in price increases. The solution seemed obvious: reduce money supply, implement fiscal discipline, restore confidence in institutions. These recommendations assumed that Venezuela's problem was economic mismanagement that could be fixed with proper policies. But Patricia discovered that Venezuela's hyperinflation was not primarily an economic phenomenon. It was a social phenomenon with economic symptoms. The collapse of the bolivar was not the cause of Venezuela's crisis. It was the result of a deeper breakdown in the social contract between the state and its citizens. In a normal economy, people accept paper money because they trust the institution that issues it. They believe the government will maintain the currency's value, that businesses will accept it, that it will function as a store of value over time. When this trust disappears, money becomes just decorated paper, regardless of how many technical economic measures are implemented. Venezuela's hyperinflation revealed something that economic textbooks rarely acknowledge. Modern money is essentially a collective hallucination. When enough people stop believing in it simultaneously, it simply ceases to exist as a functional tool, regardless of what governments or central banks do to support it. The innovation response. Rather than accepting economic collapse, Venezuelans innovated. Patricia documented dozens of monetary innovations that emerged organically throughout the country. In Maracaibo, a group of university students created a local exchange system based on labor hours. 1 hour of tutoring math equals 1 hour of computer repair equals 1 hour of home cleaning. These time banks operated entirely outside the formal economy, but provided real value to participants. In the border regions, Colombian pesos became the informal currency. Shops displayed prices in pesos, workers requested salaries in pesos, and entire communities effectively dollarized using their neighbors' currency. This happened without government approval or international agreements. It was pure market adaptation. Most remarkably, Patricia discovered that Venezuela had become one of the world's largest cryptocurrency adoption centers. Not Bitcoin or Ethereum, which were too expensive and complicated for ordinary people, but local alternatives designed specifically for daily transactions. Apps like Reserve, AirTM, and locally developed systems allowed people to store and transfer value without using banks, without using bolivars, and without waiting for government permission. The remittance revolution, one of the most misunderstood aspects of Venezuela's economy, was the role of emigration. International media focused on the human tragedy of 7 million Venezuelans leaving their country, the largest refugee crisis in Latin American history. But Patricia discovered that this exodus had created an entirely new economic infrastructure. Venezuelan immigrants didn't just leave. They maintained economic connections to their homeland through remittances. But these weren't traditional remittances sent through banks or money transfer services. They were sophisticated financial networks that bypassed both Venezuelan and international financial institutions entirely. A Venezuelan worker in Colombia could send money to her family in Caracas using a cryptocurrency app. The transaction took minutes, cost almost nothing in fees, and arrived as digital dollars that could be spent immediately. More importantly, these transactions were invisible to traditional economic measurement systems. They didn't appear in balance of payments statistics, weren't counted in GDP calculations, and weren't regulated by any government. Patricia calculated that these informal remittances were probably larger than Venezuela's entire official non-oil economy. Millions of Venezuelans had become economically dependent on money that, technically speaking, didn't exist in any official accounting system. The death of economic measurement. This realization led Patricia to a disturbing conclusion. The tools that the world used to measure Venezuela's economy were fundamentally inadequate for understanding what was actually happening. GDP statistics showed catastrophic decline year after year. Inflation statistics were meaningless because they assumed people were using bolivars for transactions. Employment statistics counted only formal jobs, missing the vast informal economy that had become most people's primary source of income. Trade statistics missed the cryptocurrency flows, the barter networks, and the service exchanges that kept society functioning. According to official measurements, Venezuela's economy had contracted by more than 75% since 2013. This was supposed to represent the most severe economic collapse outside of wartime in modern history. Yet Patricia walked through functioning markets, observed busy restaurants, and interviewed families that had adapted and were surviving. The contradiction was stark. The measurements showed total collapse, but society was clearly still operating. She realized that hyperinflation had not destroyed Venezuela's economy. It had made Venezuela's economy invisible to traditional measurement tools. The country had effectively developed a parallel economic system that operated alongside, and increasingly instead of, the official economy, the redefinition of collapse. This led Patricia to question the entire narrative of Venezuelan collapse. What did collapse mean when people continued to work, businesses continued to operate, and families continued to function? What did economic Crisis mean when innovative financial systems were emerging to replace failed traditional ones? She began to see Venezuela not as a case study in failure, but as an unintentional experiment in post-monetary society. Venezuelans had been forced to rediscover economic fundamentals that developed societies had forgotten, that value exists independent of currency, that exchange can happen without banks, and that economic relationships are ultimately social relationships. The hyperinflation that looked like pure destruction from the outside had, from the inside, forced a kind of economic evolution. Venezuelans had been compelled to develop financial literacy, technological skills, and economic adaptability that made them, in some ways, more economically sophisticated than citizens of stable economies. Patricia met taxi drivers who were experts in cryptocurrency, grandmothers who calculated real-time exchange rates faster than professional traders, and teenagers who understood international monetary policy better than economic students in developed countries. Hyperinflation had been a brutal teacher, but it had been an effective one. The international blind spot. The world's inability to understand Venezuela's adaptation revealed something important about global economic thinking. International institutions, media organizations, and academic researchers were all using analytical frameworks designed for stable, formal economies. When applied to Venezuela, these frameworks could only see failure, chaos, and collapse. Patricia realized that this wasn't necessarily wrong, but it was incomplete. Venezuela's formal economy had indeed collapsed. Venezuelan institutions had indeed failed. The Venezuelan state had indeed lost control over monetary policy. All of these things were true simultaneously with the fact that Venezuelan society had adapted, innovated, and survived. The international community's focus on government failure and institutional breakdown blinded them to citizen success and social resilience. They measured what wasn't working and missed what was working. They counted what had been destroyed and ignored what was being created. The future of money. As Patricia completed her investigation, she realized she had stumbled onto something larger than Venezuela's story. She had witnessed the future of money in a world where traditional institutions were failing. Venezuela's hyperinflation experiment had demonstrated that societies could function without stable national currencies, without traditional banking systems, and without government monetary policy. This wasn't necessarily better than having stable institutions, but it proved that alternatives were possible. The innovations emerging in Venezuela, cryptocurrency adoption, time banks, barter networks, remittance systems, were all being discussed in developed countries as solutions to inequality, financial exclusion, and institutional failure. Venezuela had been forced to implement these innovations out of necessity, but they might represent voluntary choices for other societies in the future. Patricia understood that she had documented not just the death of money, but its rebirth in new forms. The Venezuela that emerged from hyperinflation would be economically different from the Venezuela that entered it. Whether that difference represented progress or regression would depend on what values society chose to prioritize. The lesson was not that hyperinflation was beneficial. The human cost had been enormous. The lesson was that economic collapse, like economic success, was more complex and more surprising than anyone had anticipated. Venezuelan society had proved more resilient than its institutions, and that resilience had created possibilities that no one had imagined. The misreading corrected standing. Again, at that ATM in Caracas, Patricia watched the endless stream of worthless paper money and saw something different than what she had seen months earlier. She no longer saw just the death of currency. She saw the birth of economic creativity, forced innovation, and social adaptation. The world had read Venezuela's hyperinflation as an ending. Patricia had learned to read it as a beginning. Not a good beginning, not a chosen beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. And in that reframe, the entire story of Venezuelan collapse revealed itself to be the story of Venezuelan transformation. The question was not whether Venezuela had failed. The question was what Venezuela was becoming, and what the rest of the world might learn from its painful but remarkable journey beyond the boundaries of conventional economics.